So we're going to talk about 5 mistakes, or up to 5 mistakes, that we've seen with diagnostics and diagnostic submissions in our practice lifetime, and how those and kind of I would ask that you think about mistakes that would ultimately impact the decision making that in the way we use their mistakes, because ultimately they hurt the outcome and our ability to use that data that we were hoping to get, and why that's so significant. So who wants to start?
Well, I can start with one.
Okay.
One that I've seen quite commonly is that, oftentimes you could be in the middle of an investigation. You're sending your diagnostics off to your diagnostic laboratory, and then for whatever reason, you switch laboratories throughout the process. And I've also seen it where maybe you're in the middle of this investigation, and then all of a sudden you're seeing different results. And one thing that's important is that I've seen that sometimes diagnostic labs can actually switch kits for some of their molecular testing, and that can really alter the results that you get back. And that's the same for if you switch laboratories, because the standards that are in place for their kits are not going to be equal across the different laboratories. I've done a lot of investigation and comparisons between laboratories globally to see the differences, and sometimes you can see a 2-log difference between labs. And I know with certain production systems, that could be enough to, think that we need to change a whole treatment or control program. And in reality, we really just need to step back and make sure that our interpretation of the results are what they should be, that we haven't had any changes in the kit, that we haven't changed laboratories, that truly what we're seeing in the difference is what we're seeing in the field, but not just an error.
Well, and I've even heard of how they even handle and process that sample, right? Can
Yes.
vary by lab. Salmonella is a good one, where a lot of labs will pre-enrich, but they don't always if you don't ask for it. So you can't assume that they're going to do the same steps between the different labs. And I've definitely seen the cutoffs vary based on different labs for some pathogens. Delta Corona is one. I've seen labs use, even though it's just maybe one CT value, influenza. And if you've kind of got this hard and fast rule, like you said, where you've got, below a CT of 30, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to sequence, I'm going to vaccinate, I'm going to do this set of interventions, that you be prepared that you may want to do some validation and build some consistency, figure out what's a truly consistent result between labs. Don't just assume that a CT of 30 means the same thing in every lab.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean the same thing between every disease, right?
Right. And for instance, like when people are looking at CTs for ileitis, a lot of people try to use that to compare back to what the severity of the lesion or the production loss could be. But that's also going to differ between your different laboratories for those cutoffs, like you mentioned. And so if it's a CT of under 30 versus another lab, that may not equal out into the same level of severity in terms of disease. So it's important to know what standards they have put in place and what they have done to show that it correlates back to, because it will not be equal across even different regions.
Wow, that's great advice. Dr. Nair, what mistake do you see that's affected your decision making the most?
I guess mine wouldn't be necessarily related directly to diagnostic interpretation. So it would have been my time spent abroad. My first case actually being in a farm. I had seen previous results from our production system. I knew what I expected to see, and I'd walk through the barn and was with a fellow veterinarian, local fellow veterinarian, and we discussed what we saw in the barn, and we're getting ready to take some diagnostic samples, and we're doing our necropsy. What we'd expected to see based off of our clinical signs, this was a typical strep case in a nursery. And we were sitting down doing the necropsy, and we were cruising through pigs and looking at everything and collecting samples. And I look over, and my fellow veterinarian is sitting there studying the inside of the kidney. And I looked at him kind of strange, like, this is interesting. What's with a kidney? And it took me a second. I had to step back and realize where I was. I was no longer sitting in the US, and I had to think about things that I normally wouldn't be thinking about sitting in a really disease-free or potentially economically devastating disease-free country. So looking at kidneys ended up being a very important piece of our necropsies that we did from then on, but it was one of those kind of gut check moments where you had to realize where you were and what you needed to be evaluating, and not cutting any corners just because you knew you were expecting to get a certain result, and trying to make sure that your samples were submitted quickly and actually evaluating the entire case.
Wow, so our biases can hurt us, even when we've got tons of experience, because our experience maybe can be slightly biased or slightly siloed, and say I have this big picture. It's
absolutely, and in this case, it ended up being exactly a strep case, but I would hate to be that one who missed the important piece of information. So.
That's great advice, and a common mistake, because it's very easy for us. We get used to, especially we get really familiar with the system, and we kind of already make the conclusion, and that could end up hurting our client if we don't do a full workup. That kind of goes along with one that I have, which is a mistake I often see, is that you've got mortality in the barn, and veterinarians are there, or production staff's there, and maybe this is a twofer. One that they choose not to, even though we're there because there's an issue oftentimes related to mortality, and or any really type of performance issue, and we don't necropsy the dead animals. And what an easy, free, inexpensive diagnostic, right, is our gross observations. And we don't take the time to at least step through, because we go, oh, well, they're just euthanized pigs, or they were from the fall behind pen. But if you're concerned, if you're there because there's a high rate of fall behinds, then why aren't you necropsying those animals? Even if you don't intend to take tissues, I think that the gross observations are always important to have made. It's just that extra piece of data that you can add to that visit summary. Mm-hmm. And then I see people, when again, this goes back to the kind of biases. Since we already think we know what's going on because of the history of the flow or the clinical signs we're seeing, we don't collect a full tissue diagnostic set. And so we go, oh, well, I'll just take like in your case, Amelia, they could have just taken a brain swab, right? Oh, it's strep. I'll just take a swab of the brain, and I'll just send that, and that'll get me my answer. And we're thinking we're saving the client money, or hey, I don't need to spend time, handling a lot of tissues, or I don't have bags, I don't have formalin, I don't have the right tools, and we failed to get a full workup of the case. And then we wonder when our action plan doesn't matriculate, it doesn't work the way we thought it was. We look back and we're like, uh-oh, now I don't have any more data to go off of. I don't have any samples to go back to and maybe expand my breadth of testing. Mm-hmm. And maybe I don't have, if you don't submit tissues, you can't do histopath. Mm-hmm. So you don't have any lesions to maybe start redirecting your thought process. And I think that, and then we spend a lot more time. Now we got to go back out. and so now we're retreading old ground, and so it just can be a really inefficient process. And the lab is certainly, in my experience, they're usually willing to store samples, especially if you're communicating with them, to let them know that you're kind of working up a complicated case. Usually they'll hold tissues, for a week to 10 days, even if you choose not to run diagnostics test on them right from the beginning. They're there for a little period of time as you're maybe getting in and synthesizing some of your diagnostic results that, from your top differential list, right? And
so what is your rule of thumb for, like, if you're going to do the whole workup, how many pigs, when you're investigating, would you at minimum, recommend for people to do the whole workup on, or at least to save?
Yeah, so I mean, and there is no statistical basis on this. This is not based on a statistical sample size, but most, and this is, if so, I like to necropsy multiple animals. So I want to necropsy at least 5 to 10 animals. And if they're consistent, that I get a major proportion with the same set of lesions, so a dominant lesion set, then I'll pick the best 3 pigs. And, when I say the best 3 pigs to sample, ideally it's ones that aren't chronic and potentially have a lot of other complicating issues going on, but they do have the lesions, and or they're in the earlier stages of lesions. So that's the difference between that chronicity versus because sometimes you can no longer detect the the pathogen. Our diagnostic tests aren't always sensitive to as the animals get more chronic. So the ones in the earliest phase of the disease. Obviously, you'd love to have non-treated animals if you think it's a bacterial case, but that can be tough. So I don't let that inhibit me. I just try to remember that, hey, these animals have been treated as I'm reviewing my diagnostic test results. So that's the lab always will tell you, you want to get acute animals in that haven't been treated, right? And I like 3 because then you can, it's not a coin flip, right? You can have you can actually figure out if there's a dominant proportion of lesions from that case. But other people will say 5. It's always going to be an odd number there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I guess I always go with 3 too. I mean, like, and especially if you're going to collect the full set. And I always remind, like, if it's not me collecting, if it's a student or production, I mean a full set. So from head to tail, make sure we don't forget something, because you'd be surprised how often you might find something else there that you weren't even looking for. So as a differential, just to make sure that you don't miss it. So I just always tell people, if they're going to get the 3, you're already there. You might, it's like you said, you don't want to miss something and then go back and can't find it. So I think it's important to get the full set, at least minimum 3, just like you mentioned. But I also think it's important, like you said, don't dismiss the fact of looking at the pigs that have either been euthanized or that have that have passed, because those can be, the gross lesions from those can be very important to learn from. And a lot of the countries that we work in, they don't have good diagnostic labs, or they don't have diagnostic labs available, so they're not able to send samples off. Or they're not able to do technically a necropsy. They can only do it on animals that have passed. And so, but like you said, I think you can learn a lot from the gross lesions, and it'll just point you in maybe a more specific direction. And so to say you can't look because you don't have a diagnostic lab is not true. You can still do a really good investigation, but you've got to get in there and do that. So
I think that's great advice. I think it's great advice that, our gross observations and being able, because it's just one more data point and, going from clinical samples and then we get our, our lesions can continue to help us dial in that differential list for sure. Anything to add, Amelia?
No, actually, I was going to kind of piggyback off of that a little bit and take it a step further. We talk about animals that have already passed and making sure we do a complete necropsy there, but every animal that we have that runs through a production system ultimately ends up passing. So getting in and doing those slaughter checks is also a way to really evaluate the efficacy of some of your techniques that you put into your production system and making sure that you are seeing the full process, not only on animals that have died in the production system, but those that have marketed, and making sure we're evaluating production losses that are in actual top animals that have made it to market.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point too, because it can give you an idea. If you suspect something, you can start putting together the timing of that clinical picture. Also understanding the timing of that clinical picture can help you understand the potential production losses. I think a great example of that has always been mycoplasma. Groups that are going to they're going to show lesions at slaughter for mycoplasma, acute lesions. It oftentimes is not affecting the performance potentially as much as pigs that have chronic lesions at slaughter, where it would suggest that the mycoplasma infection occurred earlier in the grow out process. And I think there's some really continues to be a lot of nice work out of Europe, where they've coupled their slaughter checks with their performance metrics. And yeah, it's not, and they can even, go a little bit further and get some etiologic diagnosis on that. And I think that that's a technique I don't see being utilized as much here in the US. And probably because we have such excellent access to diagnostic labs and some really nicely trained production teams and vet support teams, but still a really important diagnostic tool. And so, yeah, I think that that's a mistake that we've stopped using or really downgraded our emphasis on slaughter checks. I think even Jim Kober talked about that this year at AASV.
Yep.
In his lectures, in the ALCOG's lecture. So I think
they're
really
even like creating new innovations, like like IT wise, to help better diagnose those lesions or even meat quality post slaughter. It's not, it's not available today, but there are companies that are working on that, where you can have this, camera set up where they're scanning every carcass, looking for defects, looking at, again, the carcass itself in terms of meat quality, and sending that information back. And so hopefully, in the next 10 to 15 years, this will also help where we can improve some of our, capabilities in doing an effective slaughter check, because I know it is very user specific. And, just from working in slaughterhouses and working with people, some of those reports we get back, it's really important to go and investigate for yourself, because you want to make sure that the people who are reporting know what they're looking for, because there can be a lot of misinformation due to artifact, or they're confusing something else. So.
Yeah, great point about artifact, because those animals, by the time we're seeing those carcasses, they've gone through quite a bit of processing steps. And yeah, there is some changes that you can appreciate to skin and other,
and depending on the country that is doing the processing as well, you may have some defaulty equipment that is contributing to a major set of lesions that don't end up being lesions at all. It's simply an artifact of processing those animals in a facility that may not be up to standard at that point in time.
Yep, that's a good point.
It's a great point. Yeah, that's fantastic information. I think, another mistake I see, and it's near and dear to my heart, is how we handle samples, and really putting the emphasis on two steps again, one close to the farm level, and that's getting a large enough piece of the tissue collected. The lab has really skilled people to trim in tissue. And so us trying to do that at the farm level, especially if you're using paraprofessionals or, other support staff members to do that, no matter how good they are at recognizing the lesion, they don't have the equipment and the infrastructure that the lab has. So for me, I like to get a size of lesion, because it also, when I've communicated with the diagnosticians, it helps them because they can put into context a little bit better with of the lesion significance if they have that larger piece of tissue. And so I think it helps them, especially if you're in a situation where you're using discretion of the diagnostician to start directing the testing of your case, that they have a large enough piece of tissue to make an assessment or a good enough history. So providing a good history, and you don't have to go back to it's not, since, the Moby Dick was a minnow, right? You don't have to go back that far. But at least saying what the context of this animal was in, the percentage, if it's a respiratory case, is there cough, is there thumping, give a percentage, have they been on treatment, have they responded to therapy, have they, what you suspect, and that helps them a lot, right, to start their diagnostic process. So again, on that front end, where before we're sending stuff off to the lab, making sure we've got large enough pieces that help them, or put it into, help them get some context, and then also providing a little history on your submission forms, I think is a good practice. And I see when my short period at the diagnostic lab, lots of cases come in and there's no history, and then, or they don't even, and there's no history and there's no test requested.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to have to stop everything and call you to be able to even start the diagnostic process. And you can imagine that that's going to delay your testing and getting an answer. And we work in a just-in-time business, and one day delay can be extremely significant for not only the animal well-being, but also for the business well-being. So you got to have some information on there.
And one thing I did to help with that when I was in production was I would go spend time with each production service guy, and make sure we walk through how to do an entire necropsy, what samples to take, why we would maybe take them, and what information, like even pre-fill out like the forms maybe for them, so that it's less work on their side, because they're trying to meet multiple farms in a day. So to make sure that there is a little bit more information, you can have it pre-filled out forms. But I just kind of made sure with every person to spend that time for training, so that there was no excuse of why they didn't know what they should collect, or improper sampling techniques, or etc. I know that takes more time out of your day, but in the end, I think you get a better result from it. And so that was just something I kind of implemented on farm.
So definitely an opportunity is education with that staff. Because what are you saying? You can't be at every farm and every outbreak?
No, not with you.
Yeah, most veterinarians or even animal health support staff are not going to be able, and biosecurity should also be considered. Our ability to travel between farms is biosecurity can limit that as well. And so another good reason to have your staff trained and spend the time on the educational side.
Yeah. I guess another one I had was if you find something and you're not sure like if it's important or not, don't just dismiss it. I feel like early in my career, we were diagnosing certain strains of mycoplasma that people were like, oh, we just ignore that. And in reality, we really shouldn't be ignoring it. And we have found over time and people investigating further, same with PCV3, with Dr. Byers, it didn't present like a typical PCV2, and you just had to keep pushing to investigate further, even if we were lacking the diagnostics. Same with PED. I think it's important that we just don't dismiss it or think, oh, it's not important because someone else told us that, to really dive deeper, because we know our farms, we know what is not normal and what shouldn't be there. And so I think that was something I learned early in my career, was to make sure that I'm comfortable and understand what is there, even if everyone's telling me it doesn't matter. So.
Yeah, that takes a lot of confidence.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not easy. And I know it wasn't easy for some of these other practitioners. Like I know Dr. Murray, she did the same thing, pushing forward on certain pathogens that everyone's saying aren't important. And maybe they're not, but if we don't investigate them, how do we know, so.
And one advantage then, now is that we've got next generation sequencing as well. So we've got some tools, even though they're pricey, we've got some tools and, some support within not only the industry, at least here in the US, we've got industry support, but even a lot of governments will help support some of those diagnostics for some of those atypical cases. So yeah, you got to trust your gut a little bit.
Yeah. Yep.
Dr. Naher, do you have anything else to add?
I think we've covered so much. I can't think of anything else.
Yeah, we really, there's, and I hate to think about them as mistakes, but a lot of opportunities to continue to emphasize the importance of diagnostics, because it's often our first step in assisting the production team and our clients in getting an action plan implemented and helping them really shape the concerns and of their business and their next steps. And so mistakes have always been opportunities for me. I've learned more from my mistakes than I have from my blatant successes. So I think that lots to learn and lots of good information here. That I appreciate you guys taking the time to have this discussion with me. And I hope everyone comes to join us at the swine campus to experience some more interactions like this. We'll be doing case studies and as well as giving you some background information to build those competencies in swine health and production. And, thanks again to my fellow speakers here today.
Thank you.
Thanks.